Okay, this is our last but not least session of the day. So for the next 4 hours, we would like to talk about climate and climate change. So there are three numbers I'm going to leave you with. You're going to hear these three numbers throughout the presentation today. So 3, 25, 22,000. 3 is the number of average storms that come across the Atlantic, category 3 to 5. So on average, every year, there are 3. 25% of the Bahamian economy was wiped out in the storm in 2019. When I was here last year, I was told we don't talk about the name of that storm. It's bad luck, and I'm superstitious, but it starts with a D. But that wiped out $3.4 billion of the economy in that year alone. And number 3 is 22,000. That is the age, the number of years ago of the last ice age. And we're going to hear about all of these topics as we go forward. So I'm very honored to have two distinguished experts, climate science, in climate science and adaptation. First is Bob Bunting. He is the CEO and the founder of the Climate Adaptation Center in Sarasota, Florida. As a renowned atmospheric scientist and educator, Bob has dedicated his career to helping communities prepare for and adapt to our changing climate. His work focuses on translating complex climate data into actionable strategies for resilience. Joining him is Agnessa Lundy, a talented environmental scientist from the Bahamas Reef Environmental Education Foundation. BRON, beg your pardon. Second part of the CV. Thank you. Very much involved in development and studying the environmental impact of development activities here throughout the Bahamas. So Bob Bunting was going to set the stage. We're going to go 10 minutes, not 2 hours. 10 minutes just to sort of set the stage and give a brief history lesson on the current climate assessment, and then Ms. Lundy will provide some perspective on climate's impact on the development activity taking place in the Bahamas. So Bob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. My name is Bob, and it does not stand for Bank of the Bahamas. But when I leave, hopefully I'll have at least that much money in donations. No, I'm just kidding. Let's see. I don't think this is working. Okay. Now it's working. Well, all right. So, on April 1st, no kidding, we will do the national forecast, which will include this area for hurricanes in 2025. And we picked April 1st because we think people will remember that date. And because the last 2 years, we've had the most accurate hurricane forecast, season forecast in the world at the Climate Center. We missed the total number of major hurricanes by 1 over 2 years, and the total number of hurricanes by just 1 over 2 years. So this is an important event that we will have in Sarasota. And actually, if you want to watch, you can just take a picture of that and you can watch it live when we give it on April 1st. So, this is basically the same slide I show all the time. We basically have two choices. We can either deal with what is, or we can make believe it's not happening. When we deal with what is, it really lowers the anxiety, but not just that, it lowers the cost. And a lot of people think that climate adaptation is a cost, but it's really not. It's an investment in a sustainable future. So I wanted to show you, this is the last ice age we had, and you can see it was about 24,000 years ago. And the Earth normally warms the fastest coming out of an ice age. That's the fastest warming we ever have naturally. And it took about 12,000 years for it to warm 3 degrees. And when it did reach that zero line, which is about 8,000 BC, there were only 5 million people on the planet, roughly. And during the next roughly until 1950, we were within 1 degree of that average. And that's when we went from 5 million to 5 billion people on the planet. So we're very temperature dependent on this planet for human life. And now that we have air conditioning and modern, enjoyments, we have extended our range, but we're still very susceptible to a warming climate. And since 1950, we've had an absolute runaway climate warming on Earth. This is the fastest climate warming we've seen in 1,000,000 years of records. And you might say, well, how do we know that? Well, the reason we know it is because we have ice cores that go down 1,000,000 years ago. And in those ice cores is the exact makeup of the atmosphere at that time. How much CO2, how much methane, and we can convert that to temperature of the time. And so we have pretty good records that far back. Now, right now, we're moving into a very precarious position. We're about 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we were in 1900. And that's an incredibly fast climate warming. And that's driving a lot of activity, including hurricanes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when you look at that chart and then look at this one, you'll see a correlation, which correlations are not necessarily causal, but they are significant. And that's the population of the world as it grew. You can see it took off as modern times began. And now we're at 8 billion people. And 8 billion of us are emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse warming planet. It's just the way this planet is. It's always been that way. And when you put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere warms. It's a thermodynamics, basically. So I want to show you that back in 1960, the beginning of the satellite era, we had various amounts of hurricanes and major hurricanes. And I broke this down into roughly 20-year time frames. And you can see that in the latest period from 2000, the number of category 4 and 5 hurricanes have doubled or more. And that's in a roughly 25-year period. And so this is a significant change. And why this has happened is because the atmosphere has warmed and there's a lot of excess energy in the atmosphere that has to go somewhere. And these storms redistribute the energy of the world when it gets too hot to the polar areas, and these big storms are what do it. And that's nature's way of trying to get back in balance. Unfortunately, we're in the way of some of these, and that's why we're having the issues we have. I just want to say that in the United States, in the last 7 years, we've had 10 major hurricanes, 3, 4, or 5. And since 2000, we've had more Category 5 hurricanes than we had in the 20th century. So it's really exponentially going up here, and the impacts are going up at the same time. Of course, this is a beautiful country, but it's very low-lying, so it has risks probably at the top of the pyramid as far as risk from climate-induced events. These are all the tracks you can see. Bill was talking about 3 hurricanes is our normal major hurricanes every year. Last year we had 5. By 2050, we're expecting 6 as an average number. So again, another double of major hurricanes in the next 30 years. And so this is driving a lot of things, the warming. One is sea level rise. The sea levels here have already risen about 11 inches since 1950. When you have a low-lying country and you lose 20% of your buffer, that means even a normal storm will do a lot more damage. And we're expecting another 9 inches of sea level rise right here by 2050. So right now we have time to prepare for this over time, but we don't have a lot of time. And if we decide, not to deal with it, it will deal with us. So that is the choice we have. And so I wanted to show you this slide, and you can, in the 2030s is going to be especially scary because we have a moon that orbits the Earth, and every 36 years, it comes into close contact with the Earth, and that's going to happen around 2035. The moon is now getting close to the Earth, and when that does, it pulls the tide to this side of the Earth, and we have excess sea level rise during that period. We call it the moon wobble, but it's really just the rotation, an elliptical rotation of the moon around the Earth, and it will be close in 2035. And so between now and then, we'll be seeing the sea level rise just from that occurrence. And in the old days, it didn't really matter much whether we got 3 or 5 inches of sea level rise, but now it really does matter for every inch that we get. And then the other threat, of course, is summer heat and humidity. The average temperature here in the summertime will rise about 2 degrees more by 2050. So that means when we do have a storm and the power grid goes down, we could have long periods of power outages and then a heat wave that follows. And those two combinations really create the setup for a catastrophic event from a number of people who could die actually of heat after a storm. So the micro impacts of a warming climate really, what we really have to look at is the public infrastructure, which needs to adapt to what we're forecasting, not the old climate that we used to have, building on the standards that we had in the 1950s and 1990s, but for standards that are modernized to what we expect by 2050. So this is a change of looking out the front of the window of the car and not looking out your rear view mirror. And right-sizing our infrastructure is really the bottom line. So all the choices that you make here in the next few years are very, very important choices, and you need to right-size your infrastructure. I know this sounds like an expense, but it's also an adaptation strategy that down the line will save $15 on the back end for every dollar you invest on the front end. So in climatized development, we have to build whatever we're going to build here, whether it's new resorts or whatever, to these standards. And we have to ensure that we prevent the losses of the future on the front end, as I was saying. So development wants really is we have to align the wants we want for development with sustainable outcomes. If we build and run, which is what the model is in a lot of places, and I imagine it's here, where you have a developer that would love to come in and build a new resort or condo complex, and they build it and they get paid and then they leave, and we're left holding the bag afterward and paying for the costs that we did not engineer into the front end of these developments. Now, maybe that would raise the price a little bit on the front end, like I said, but you'd be surprised how little additional cost using modern techniques for adaptation and what the results will be after you have these repeated hurricanes. So that's my first few comments. I want to make one more comment, and that is about power. You know, it's a fact that in the United States, we haven't embraced nuclear power for a long time. And it's also a fact that it's the only energy source in the United States where there has not been one death. You can't say that from coal mining or oil drilling or natural gas production or building solar arrays or windmills. And the nice thing about nuclear energy these days is that the reactors are much smaller, much easier to build, and so they're more cost efficient, but they don't emit a single gram of greenhouse gases. So if we're really going to do something that's meaningful, we have to embrace the technologies, even though there is a slight risk. The bigger risk is not to. So I will end up with that.
Is this way?
This one right here.
Okay, fine. Yeah. No, that's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Agnessa Lundy, and I'm the Associate Principal of the Earth Division at BRON. Right, we help developers develop, right? So my job as an environmental consultant or development consultant and as a Bahamian, right, is to see how we can encourage developers to build in the Bahamas in a sustainable way or in as a sustainable way as possible. Sometimes we're successful, we're able to negotiate and broker through the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection and the Forestry Unit really good mitigation and best management practices. And sometimes they don't go the way that I would like. But, right, I am confident that BRON is doing a really good job with navigating the environmental management planning process. Right, so I'll go through what that is in a minute. Okay, so proactive risk management really entails identifying what the risks are, right? And truly understanding what those risks are means understanding the short-term immediate impacts and the long-term systemic impacts, right? So short-term impacts, for example, the hurricane hits and you have storm surge. You have to manage and adapt to that right away. The long-term impacts related to climate change, for example, would be sea level rise. It's gradual, it's slow, but it's gonna accumulate and build over time, right? And you have to design proactively before it gets to the right 2050, right? What are we gonna do when we lose that landmass, right? Okay, the next part of understanding the risk is really how do you monitor them and how do you adapt to them? So real life example, and I think it's a double-edged sword, right? So in 2017, we had a Hurricane Irma, and we evacuated about 3,500 people, right, from the Southern Bahamas. What we learned is it's great to evacuate people, but where they going? Where they going on a capital that's already overcrowded, right? So then we learned from that lesson, we adapted. In 2019, we evacuated again. We had shelters, so we learned that lesson and we adapted it. But what are the state of those shelters, right? I personally know people who evacuated in Grand Bahama and they had to evacuate twice. 2 shelters collapsed, right? Could you imagine? So how do we apply those lessons learned, right? We already learned, yes, it's good to evacuate, but where they going? Okay, we planned, we're gonna have more shelters. Okay, but what are the state of those shelters? How do we fix that? Right? So we monitor and we adapt. And the next step is to encourage innovation, adopt new technologies, adopt new strategies, listen to students when they come to you with ideas. They're not used to someone saying no, especially this new generation. Like, I don't care, they can do what they're gonna do. Sometimes they have really good ideas, right? Okay, so why is proactive risk management important? It helps you identify the problem before so that you could save money. And the stat that I found was every proactive from the World Bank, For every dollar spent in proactive climate action, you save $4 to $6. But I like Bob's stat better. $1 saves you $15. Let's go that one, right? So a good example of that is if you have a seawall. The purpose of the seawall is to interrupt the erosion and the seawall. The seawater energy, right? So over time, it's going to break down. So your initial investment is construction of the seawall. Let's say you leave it there. Not that we do that in Bahamas, right? We maintain and we monitor, right? So, right? So you have your seawall and there's a hole in it. You have to spend your $20, your $30, gross exaggeration, but your $20, your $30 and repair the seawall so it does the job that you built it to do, right? That is definitely cheaper than leaving the hole in the wall and then the storm comes, right? So then you have to you have to rebuild everything that you were trying to protect initially with your seawall, which is significantly more expensive than your $20, $30 annually to maintain said seawall. You see? Okay. Next slide. I thought we'd have more students, but I'll go through this anyway. So remember when I said that students really sometimes have really good ideas? So these are just some examples that I found. In UE, the students successfully lobbied to install solar panels. It's up and running, right? In Barbados, the students designed a solar-powered desalination system. Again, still up and running. Research it yourself, right? And then Bahamian students are consistently contributing to mangrove and coral reef restoration projects, which are also very important for climate action. Right? So other ways that we can contribute in the financial world, we can invest, integrate, and support, right? And my favorite thing is really the parametric insurance. Have you heard about that before? No. Oh, okay, cool. So it is so regular insurance, you have to file a claim for the most part, right, and get your payout. For parametric insurance, you have based on a predetermined condition, you trigger a payout. So that gives people time and resources to prepare better for the storm. So if I'm a fisherman, right, and I need to move my boat, right, I know that I'm a part of this parametric insurance. When, let's say the predetermined condition is hurricane, category 5 hurricane is 20 miles offshore, right? The insurance companies know, okay, there's a hurricane. They're working with the Department of Meteorology. They know it's 20 miles offshore. Everyone who's a part of this insurance, let's pay 10% of their policy out. So now this fisherman can get their boat and remove it from the water and take it to a hurricane-safe boat storage facility. You see? That is definitely cheaper than the insurance company have to pay out the full amount on the policy if something happens to the boat because of the storm. You see? And the key takeaways, I didn't want to be long, I know it's at the end of the day, right? So the key takeaways are really that proactive risk management really is beneficial if you really incorporate your policies and your action together and you really monitor and adapt as you move along, right? And large ocean states like the Bahamas really is quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So being proactive is going to be crucial. It's going to be key, right? And to integrate how this, works with BRON. So we have a lot of foreign direct investments coming in. A lot of our clients are foreign direct investors. And through the environmental impact assessment process, we have to identify the risk, right? Which is that first part. Understand how cutting down this tree is going to impact, first of all, this habitat and then the biodiversity that lives on it, right? And then we have to monitor and adapt to that, right? So we know that it's going to lead to habitat fragmentation, for example. So through the landscape architecture and the forestry unit, we help the developers design, I want to say, ecological corridors, right? So it helps reduce habitat fragmentation. Now, what percentage of the project site becomes this ecological corridor? That becomes a little nitty-gritty, right? So, and then after we prepare the impact assessment and we've decided how we're going to mitigate manage. We create something called an environmental management plan. And the management plan is really meant to shift with the project, right? So every few years, if there's major changes to the project or new situations, we adapt the management plan based on the laws of the country, based on the environment, and based on the needs of the developer, right? So that is how the process of proactive risk management really works in our world. Okay, and that's it. Okay.
Thank you both for your presentations. We're going to open it up for questions from the audience. We have one question on the exact opposite side of the room.
Thank you for your presentation. I was curious, are there any credible research efforts into disrupting weather events? And I understand I'm saying this as a person coming from a country whose president suggested nuking hurricanes 6 years ago. Are there any credible efforts on this front?
Well, what I want to say is back in the day, we used to seed hurricanes. What we would do is we would fly around the eye, and I was in the hurricane hunters during that time, and we would seed it with silver iodide crystals. The idea was if we made it rain harder, there would be less wind because the wind energy would go into rain rather than into wind. And this worked just like a charm. There would be a big dip in the speed of the winds around the eye, but it only lasted for a few days, and then the hurricane would get larger in extent and re-intensify. So after we did that for about 5 years, we decided, that's not a good idea. So what we learned is that, and what we're seeing now is that if you create a lot more precipitation, you create a lot more problems. And for every degree that the atmosphere warms, it can hold 7% more water per degree. So when you see the floods, like we just had big floods yesterday and thunderstorms in the Midwest of the United States, it's because the carrying capacity of these storms now is double what it was in 1970. So this is another risk that we see in climate, is that the same kinds of systems can now produce double the excess precipitation. So that's why flooding is getting to be a more and more prevalent thing. And it should also be worked into our financial models, because that risk is really underrated at this point, not just in the insurance companies, but it's also in homeowners who think that they're not in a floodplain, but those floodplains were determined by storms that produced half the precipitation of what the storms today produce. So we're modeling the future looking in the rearview mirror instead of looking out the front windows. And we have to change that if we want to be successful in repurposing the money we do have to a more effective adaptation strategy.
Yeah, I have two questions, one to each of you. My understanding is that globally, each country is to spend about 2% of GDP to prepare for these eventualities. Do you think that will happen? And my second question is, in the Bahamas, only about 30% of people have insurance to cover hurricanes, at least before the last hurricane. Insurance has gone up quite a bit since then. So my suggestion was that we form a national captive insurance plan that everybody would have to participate in based on the square footage of their homes. And that would provide the funding in the event that there was another major hurricane. But the point is the monies would roll over every year and become quite substantial, so that you actually make money on those monies instead of paying premium every year and that disappearing to insurance companies. And then if you were not happy with that, you could buy additional insurance with insurance companies in like $5,000 allotments.
You want me to?
No, you can.
Okay. Well, 2% would be great. And I would say, yes, if we can shift from prevention, from response to prevention, and shift a significant amount of the money to the front end, 2% would end up being 20 to 30%, if you know what I mean, because the multipliers 10 to 15. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we're going to pay one way or the other. And this is what people are learning. In the United States alone, in the last 5 years, there have been $700 billion of damage from hurricanes in 5 years. So it's getting to be more than round off error at this point. A trillion here and a trillion there, as someone once said about billions, it turns out to be a lot of money. So it's starting to get economically important that we actually have a strategy to, I say, to lower the risk for things that we are sure are going to happen, like 100% sure are going to happen. So what a lot of the arguments have been is, how sure are you? Well, I'm 95% sure, and I'll take that bet every day. If I can win 95% of the time and lose 5%, I'm going to make that bet every day. And that's where we are now. The climate science is so good right now that for the next 30 years, we're not going to be off by very much. So it's almost a sure bet at this point. But the conversation is, it's a forecast. But the forecast is, almost a sure thing at this point. So I think that if we invest well, we'll do well. If we don't, we're going to have climate adaptation anyway, and it's not going to be pretty.
Thank you, Bob. Maybe just one last question for both of you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, she had a second.
Ms. Lundy, please, please, please.
Hello. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So I like the idea of the national insurance, and I'd say there's the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund, right? And I know that they're looking at parametric insurance and trying to research how it could apply here. And there's also I want to say it's the climate change unit that was recently established in the Office of the Prime Minister. And they are also looking at that as well. So I would say I could probably put you in touch with both of those agencies. If that's I don't know as much of a response as I could.
I
Yeah.
have one other comment to make just about that. Right now, thank you. The Climate Adaptation Center is now in a project with Guy Carpenter Reinsurance Company, the University, American Florida International University, the University of Michigan, and the University of California at Santa Cruz to do a parametric insurance policy where we have two different risk pools that are climatologically not likely to happen at the same time. So we might have one pool in Florida for Category 3 hurricanes and another one for wildfires in California that have a negative correlation. And so we're doing this study so that one pool can insure the other. And so it's not a national insurance policy, but it's more like a pairing of insurance risk where you are limiting the chance of a bad thing happening from an insurance point of view by one group covering the risk of another.
Terrific. So just to conclude from both of you, if you had one big idea from an adaptation standpoint? Just one big idea that you could impose or suggest or recommend to government officials to really help address this issue, particularly for the Bahamas and in this region. What's your idea?
My idea would be, especially for the Bahamas, is that it's a low-lying region and it's going to have more and more serious flooding. So I know this isn't popular, but I would say that I would have no new developments that are below 4 feet above sea level, 0 new developments.
For me, so my background is marine science, project management, community engagement, right? So I would say just from my time traveling the Bahamas and speaking to people from all walks of life, especially like farmers and fishermen, really invest in the protected areas, especially those that are adjacent to those communities, right? So the spillover effect is real from protected areas, and the protection that people can get from mangroves and coral reefs, if they are really well protected, is significant. So I would say really invest in your protected area system.
Terrific. Well, let me conclude this panel just by saying there's hope. There's hope at this table with your leadership, your thought leadership, and we hope that we can continue the dialogue around this important issue for this region. But thank you both, and please join me for thanking our panelists.
As we conclude, I just want to say to you before you leave, there is an interest in doing a group photo just outside. If you exit to my left and your right, please, so that we could commemorate our wonderful time together. I have a lot of bad ideas. And so I listened to the last panel and I mean, grateful for their thoughts. So my idea on the most extreme end of things, extreme end, is if everything else doesn't work, we should have a national evacuation treaty with the United States of America. And we should sign an agreement that we could evacuate to America. And then we should have a proactive lease agreement with about 50 cruise ships that says, once the order is given, we've already paid you over the last 50 years, get my citizens to my evacuation site. That's my most extreme bad idea. So let me take this opportunity to thank you all, please, for a wonderful, I think, very rich and thoughtful set of discussions today. And to begin that, thank you by thanking President Janine Harder, who joined us this morning, Minister Halkidas, who joined us this morning, to thank GIC for again partnering with us on this venture. And the only way we're doing it next time is if we go to Freeport. Everybody say, yeah. Thank you. Oh, the Nasuvian said, no. Okay, we'll take a day and go to Freeport there. We also want to thank the Ministry of Tourism for providing assistance with ground transportation for our GIC guests. And especially to mention Ms. Miller and her team and the professional and efficient concierge service that they provided at LPIA. True or not true? Thank you to them. We want to thank the Central Bank of the Bahamas, which will host a roundtable discussion tomorrow. And here at the University of the Bahamas, I want to thank the following persons. Astronique Nikki Bow from ORU and her team. I want to thank the video producer, Don Sargent. Is he Don in the back there? And his team. Our IT technician, Addison Saunders, and his team. And Chef Ellie and his team. Was that food not good? Oh, I enjoyed that. Okay. And of course, last but not least, I want to thank you, but that's not true. That's not the last. Ladies and gentlemen, you see that lady in the back there? Jeannie Gibson. She's a policy assistant at the Government and Public Policy Institute, and I promise you, she has been the driving force behind this partnership. And I want to thank her very much for always putting on excellent meetings, conferences, and lectures. And of course, she's joined by our team members. Also, I don't know what I'd do without these folks. We have Mrs. Leslie Archer, who's a policy fellow in the Government and Public Policy Institute, and my other boss, Pauline Bow, who is my executive assistant. And of course, we want to thank you, our audience, for attending. By the way, we had people watching by Facebook. We didn't mention that, but we had a Facebook audience, which was thickest, I understand, Dr. Harker, when you were speaking, but it was constant throughout the day. And so we want to thank all of them and all of you. Again, we really appreciate you, and see you again next year, and let's go take that photo. And all our panelists, all our speakers, all our panelists, you were great. Thank you. Thank you.